James Gale was a 42-year-old man who seemed to have it all: money, power, and status. Yet, one night, he realized that all his wealth and achievements couldn't buy him the one thing he lacked: an heir. He needed a child. However, James had no interest in forming a traditional family. 2 failed marriages had left him convinced that love was nothing more than an illusion that caused unnecessary complications. But a child was different. A child was an investment, a legacy, a continuation of his empire. Determined to avoid emotional entanglements, James decided to approach the matter purely as a transaction. With his resources, he believed it wouldn't be difficult to find someone willing to carry a pregnancy under a clear and simple contract. The following morning, James was driving his sleek sports car through the city streets, his mind entirely consumed by his plan. As he stopped at a red light near downtown, something unusual caught his attention. On the sidewalk corner, a young woman sat on the ground, sketching on a piece of dirty paper. Her messy brown hair fell over her face, and her blue eyes shone with an intensity that contrasted with her tired and worn appearance. Though she seemed invisible to the people passing by, something about her intrigued James. He tried to ignore her and drove away when the light turned green, but the image of her sitting there lingered in his mind. Who sketches on the sidewalk as if the world doesn't exist? He wondered. Frustrated with himself for caring, he sped off. A few blocks later, James pulled into a parking lot and sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel. The idea of leaving her behind gnawed at him. Muttering to himself about the ridiculousness of the situation, he finally gave in to his instincts. Turning the car around, he drove back to the spot where he had seen her. She was still there, leaning against the wall, completely absorbed in her sketch. James pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window. "Hey, come here," he called out, his tone direct and unyielding. The young woman looked up, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as she assessed the well-dressed man in the luxury car. She didn't move. "I'm not asking," James continued. "Come on. I don't have all day." Reluctantly, she stood and approached the car. Up close, her thin frame and the weariness etched on her face were even more noticeable, yet her posture and steady gaze conveyed a quiet resilience. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Get in," James said. "I'll take you somewhere we can talk." She laughed dryly. "I'm not one of those, if that's what you're thinking." "Don't be absurd," James replied, frowning. "I don't have time for that. I just want to talk. Now, get in the car, or go back to your sidewalk." Her hesitation lingered, but something in his authoritative tone left no room for argument. Finally, she opened the door and got in. The silence between them during the drive was heavy, but James seemed unfazed. He stopped at a quiet cafe far from the city's noise and led her to a table in the corner. "What's your name?" he asked as they sat down. "Harley Parker." "But why does it matter?" she replied, her wariness still evident. "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with. Tell me, Harley, why do you sit on the sidewalk sketching like nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go. I lost everything." "But that's none of your business." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Fine. I'll get straight to the point. I want to make you an offer, something that could change your life." Her eyes narrowed as she studied him. "And what would that be?" "I want you to have a child for me." Harley blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "You're joking, right?" "No," James replied firmly. "It's a serious offer. I'll cover all your expenses, provide full support during the pregnancy, and in the end, you'll receive an amount that will ensure you never have to worry about money again." Harley let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms. "This is insane. What kind of man makes such an offer to a stranger?" "The kind of man who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time," James answered. "I don't want a relationship, Harley. I don't want emotional drama. Just a child. Simple as that." Harley stared at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but his gaze was steady and serious. His cold, logical demeanor unsettled her, leaving her torn between disbelief and curiosity. "This is madness," she said finally. "No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this." James didn't waver. "No woman in your position would refuse. he said bluntly. I'm offering you a way out, comfort, stability, and a new life, in exchange for something you already have. The ability to bear a child. Harley crossed her arms, trying to mask the internal conflict brewing within her. On the surface, she resisted, but deep down, she couldn't deny that he was right. She lived in a reality where survival was her daily battle. Yet, the thought of trading something so profoundly personal for money turned her stomach. And then what? She asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. What happens after the baby is born? James leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor suggesting he had anticipated the question. After the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum to start over. No strings attached. You'll be free to live your life as you wish. No strings attached, she repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. How do I know you won't change your mind and drag me into court later? His gaze was steady as he replied, I'm a businessman. I don't enter agreements without ensuring both parties benefit. There will be a legally binding contract. Neither of us will have the power to alter the terms. She fell silent, absorbing his words. The promise of financial security, even if temporary, was alluring. She had nothing now, not even a place to sleep that night. Yet, she couldn't ignore the gravity of the decision in front of her. And if I say no, she challenged, leaning forward. James's faint smile revealed his confidence. Then you return to the streets, continue scraping by, facing the cold and hunger. The choice is yours. His blunt words hit her like a blow. She wanted to hate him for his audacity, but it was the truth in his statement that stung the most. He had cornered her, and they both knew it. Why are you doing this? She demanded, her voice sharp. You're rich. Why not adopt a child or find someone else willing to have one for you? James exhaled, his tone more serious. Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood. Adoption and relationships in my social circle come with complications I don't want. This is about control. Nothing more, nothing less. His candor unsettled her, and she turned her gaze away. The honesty in his words only deepened her vulnerability. I need time to think, she said, regaining a sliver of control. James nodded, as if expecting her response. You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother contacting me. Without another word, he stood and left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As Harley wandered the streets that evening, James's words echoed in her mind. Comfort, stability, a new life. The biting cold pierced her skin, a harsh reminder of the unchanging struggles she faced. She had no home, no security, no hope. Her mother's words came to her then. Opportunities only knock once. It's up to you to decide whether to seize them or let them slip away, but at what cost? Having a child, even as part of a business deal, was a monumental decision. But it could be her only escape from the endless cycle of misery. Meanwhile, James sat in his expansive living room, reviewing the contract his lawyers had finalized. He hated waiting but was confident she would accept. If not, he would move on. The plan was simple. The intercom buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. His receptionist announced Harley's arrival. Send her up, he said. When the door opened, she stepped inside. Her eyes were tired, but her expression was resolute. I accept, she said bluntly. James stood, studying her carefully. There was no hesitation in her voice, only determination. Good. Let's make this official. He handed her the contract and gestured for her to sit. She read the terms carefully. All her expenses covered during the pregnancy, a substantial sum upon the baby's birth, and a complete relinquishment of parental rights. This feels so final, she murmured. That's the point, James replied. It's what you want too, isn't it? Harley hesitated but then picked up the pen. With a single stroke, she signed her name, sealing the deal that would change both their lives. Later that day, James's assistant, Daniel, escorted her to a waiting car. As they drove through the city, Harley stared out the window. The streets she had once navigated as a struggling, invisible figure now seemed different, as if offering a glimmer of hope. Daniel broke the silence. You'll like the place. It's quiet, spacious, and comfortable. Harley nodded, still processing everything that had unfolded. When the car arrived at James's mansion, Her eyes widened in astonishment. The massive iron gates swung open to reveal manicured gardens and an imposing marble and glass structure. The mansion was breathtaking, yet cold, much like the man who owned it. For Harley, it symbolized both a chance at escape and a cage she would have to live in, at least for now. Daniel led Harley inside, and she barely had time to take in the extravagant details: crystal chandeliers, wide marble staircases, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a high-end design magazine. The grandeur made her uneasy. This wasn't her world, but for now, it was her new reality. "I'll show you to your room," Daniel said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Harley followed him in silence. Upon entering the room, she was greeted by a massive bed with linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bathroom larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Daniel added before leaving her alone. Harley sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft fabric of the sheets. It felt surreal. Until yesterday, she had been sleeping on cold sidewalks, and now she was surrounded by luxury. But as comfortable as it was, a heavy feeling lingered in the air. She wasn't a guest, she was part of a business deal. In the days that followed, Harley tried to adjust to her new routine. Meals were served promptly, and a team of doctors conducted initial exams. James, as expected, kept his distance. He was focused on work, rarely appearing around the house except to check on reports that Daniel gave him about Harley's progress. On one of the rare occasions they crossed paths, Harley was leaving a medical appointment when she saw James walking toward her. His posture was impeccable, his expression serious. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone more out of obligation than concern. Harley hesitated before answering. "Everything is as expected, I guess." He nodded without deepening the conversation. Before walking away, he gave her one last look. "If you need anything, ask Daniel. I want you to be well." She didn't know what to make of the comment. Was it genuine kindness or just a way to ensure the agreement went smoothly? Either way, the brief encounter lingered in her mind. Though she was treated like a queen, Harley couldn't ignore the dilemmas that arose within her. One silent night, she walked to the balcony of her room, looking out at the vast garden illuminated by moonlight. Everything was so calm, so far from the reality she knew. "Am I doing the right thing?" she thought, hugging herself against the cold wind. The idea of carrying a child and then giving it away seemed increasingly complex. The contract made it clear she would have no rights to the child, but she wasn't sure how she would handle it emotionally. Meanwhile, James watched from a distance. He recognized Harley's resilience but also the emotional weight she carried. Despite his cold demeanor, he felt a faint twinge of curiosity about her. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unusual proposal? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that she might be more than just a part of his plan? One evening, Harley was in the living room browsing through a book from the shelf. She wasn't a fan of classic literature, but the quiet of the house and the scent of old books were comforting. James walked in, surprising her. He seemed distracted, holding a folder of documents in his hand. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied with a sarcastic smile. He frowned but didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I think so," she answered hesitantly. "But it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." James leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't have to feel real. This is a contract, Harley. An agreement. I assure you, everything will be carried out exactly as planned." "That's what you do, isn't it?" she said, her tone edged with defiance. "Plan everything. Calculate everything. Leave no room for mistakes." He looked at her closely, as if deciding whether the conversation was worth continuing. "That's how I've built everything I have. Planning prevents failure," he finally replied. Harley gave a short laugh, shaking her head. "Sometimes failure is inevitable. You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel." Her words hit him like a blow. He leaned back in the chair without replying. Harley noticed his reaction but didn't push further. She picked up the book and headed to her room, leaving James alone deep in thought. Days went by, and Harley began adjusting to life in James Gale's mansion. The grandeur and comfort of her surroundings contrasted sharply with the emotional emptiness she felt. At night, alone in her room, she reflected on what she had left behind. It wasn't much, but it had been her life. Now, everything felt out of control. What would it be like to carry a child and then hand it over? She tried to push those thoughts away, but they haunted her, especially in the stillness of the night. While Harley grappled with her inner conflicts, James continued to observe her from afar. Amidst his commitments and meetings, he found himself thinking about her more than he expected. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, but a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, returning home after a long day of meetings, James found Harley in the garden. She sat on a bench, her face tilted toward the sky. The sight contrasted sharply with the tough image he had of her. For a moment, James hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Eventually, he walked over, his steps measured. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked, his tone firm and direct. Harley turned slightly, startled but quick to respond. "It's nice. Definitely better than the streets." He sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. There was something disarming about her honesty. "Are you settling in?" he asked. Harley shrugged, her gaze fixed on the flowers in front of her. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life." James was quiet for a moment before replying. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned?" she repeated, her tone tinged with irony. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Her question caught him off guard. He wasn't used to people questioning him, most simply agreed. "Planning is what keeps everything running. Without it, things fall apart," he said firmly. Harley gave a faint smile, shaking her head. "I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words unsettled him more than he expected. Abruptly, he stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "If you need anything, let Daniel know," he said before walking back to the house. A few days later, James chose to accompany Harley to a medical appointment. He justified his presence as ensuring everything was proceeding smoothly, but deep down, he felt an unfamiliar sense of responsibility. Harley didn't show much reaction, though she was inwardly intrigued. At the doctor's office, the usual examinations were conducted. For the first time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Harley was overwhelmed by unexpected emotion. Tears filled her eyes, though she tried to hide them. James, on the other hand, remained still. His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze shifted, as though the sound had touched a part of him he wasn't prepared to confront. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said with a smile. "You can start thinking about the next steps for prenatal care." Harley nodded silently, while James remained stoic. The car ride back to the mansion was steeped in heavy silence. James seemed lost in thought, and Harley didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. When they arrived, he surprised her by opening her door, a small gesture she hadn't expected. "Thank you for today," Harley said softly as she stepped out. "It was the least I could do," James replied, avoiding her gaze. "I'll make sure everything continues to go well." Harley watched as he walked back into the mansion. His posture was as impeccable as always, but there was something different about him. Perhaps the sound of the heartbeat had stirred something he wasn't ready to face. Or maybe it was just her imagination. In the days that followed, Harley noticed subtle changes. James appeared more frequently in the common areas and asked more questions about her well-being. Their brief conversations became less mechanical. One evening during dinner, James broke the silence. "Have you thought about what you want to do after this is over?" he asked. Harley blinked, caught off guard. It was the first time he'd shown any interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she admitted. "I still don't know what my life will be like after this." James nodded thoughtfully. "You'll have the resources to start over wherever you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile." She studied him, trying to decipher his words. Beneath his calculated exterior, there seemed to be a trace of genuine concern. It was hard to interpret, but for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. One morning, Harley found a package at her door. It was wrapped impeccably, with a handwritten note attached. To help with your free time inside, she found a sketchbook and high-quality pencils. Speechless, she ran her fingers over the supplies. She had mentioned her love of drawing once, in passing, and never expected James to remember, let alone act on it. That evening, while she was sketching in the garden, James passed by. He paused and asked casually, "Did you like the gift?" "Yes," she replied, holding up the sketchbook. "Thank you. I didn't expect it." James shrugged. "It seemed like something that could be good for you." Harley smiled, clutching the gift. "It is." Despite the comforts of the mansion, Harley couldn't escape a growing sense of disconnection. She felt like a bystander in her own life, consumed by inner conflicts. James, meanwhile, maintained his reserved demeanor, but Harley began to sense there was more to him than he allowed to show. One morning, James requested a meeting with her after breakfast. Harley entered the sitting room, finding him waiting by a stack of papers. "I want to discuss some additional details of the contract," he said directly. Harley's stomach tightened. "More details? I thought everything was already settled." She tried to hide her tension as she replied, and James studied her for a moment before continuing. "It's nothing that changes the terms. I just want to ensure you understand what things will be like after the birth. I want to avoid any surprises." Harley took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. "I think I get it. I'll leave and you'll go on with your life." He nodded slightly. "Yes, but I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, regardless of the agreement, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." She raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by his offer. His tone was different, softer, as if he was trying to show a consideration that hadn't been there before. "That's unexpected, coming from you," she said, unable to hide a touch of sarcasm. James shrugged. "I don't want complications, and this is the best way to avoid them." Harley chuckled, but his seriousness gave her pause. Maybe he really was trying, even if he didn't fully understand how to express it. Later that day, Harley decided to explore the mansion further. It was a sprawling place, with endless hallways and rooms decorated with artwork that likely cost more than she could fathom. As she wandered, she discovered a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and she peeked inside. James was sitting at the desk, but he didn't appear to be working. He was holding a framed photograph, staring at it with a distant expression. She couldn't make out the details of the image, but something about his posture caught her attention. It was the first time she'd seen him like this, vulnerable, lost in thought. She knocked softly on the door, and he quickly set the photograph back on the desk. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said hesitantly. James looked up, clearly startled to see her. "It's nothing," he replied, his face quickly regaining its neutral mask. "Did you need something?" "No, I was just exploring the house." Harley hesitated, then added, "You seemed like you were thinking about something important." He was silent for a moment before replying, "We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves." Sensing that he didn't want to continue the topic, she shifted gears. "This house is huge. Do you live here alone all the time?" He nodded, crossing his arms. "It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions, and here I have the space I need." Harley studied him, trying to understand how someone could live surrounded by so much luxury yet seem so isolated. "That must be strange," she said without thinking. "Having all this but no one to share it with?" James looked away, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm used to it. I don't need anyone to do what I do." She wanted to believe him, but there was something in his tone that suggested otherwise. Before she could respond, James stood. "If you need anything, Daniel can help," he said, ending the conversation. That night, Harley stepped out onto the terrace. The sky was clear, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. She let her mind wander, thinking about the sound of the baby's heartbeat from the checkup, a sound that had stirred feelings she couldn't quite understand. She was trying to maintain emotional distance, but it was becoming harder. Footsteps approached behind her, and Harley turned to see James. He looked tired, but his posture was as rigid as ever. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked. "I like the silence," she replied. "It helps me think." He stood beside her, gazing at the city lights. "Thinking isn't always a good thing," he said softly. Harley laughed dryly. Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone. James didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice held an unfamiliar sadness. Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either. She glanced at him, noticing the vulnerability in his words. Maybe you need something you can't control, James, she said without filtering her thoughts. He frowned, as though he wanted to respond but decided against it. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Harley alone with her own thoughts. In the following weeks, Harley found it harder to maintain a barrier between herself and James. He remained enigmatic, but moments of his true self seemed to slip through. At the same time, James grappled with emotions he didn't know how to name. What had begun as a calculated agreement was proving to be far more complex. Harley wasn't just part of the plan anymore, and that realization scared him. The next week, another checkup approached. Harley woke early, a mix of anxiety and curiosity buzzing within her. The months were passing faster than she had anticipated, and the idea of seeing the baby, however fleetingly, made her heart race. At breakfast, she found James reviewing documents with Daniel. "Ready?" he asked, looking up. "Ready enough," Harley replied, trying to sound calm. "Great. We'll go together," he said firmly, leaving no room for discussion. In the car, the silence between them was heavier than usual. James appeared focused, but there was something different about him. Perhaps he was just as nervous. Though she would never admit it, Harley could sense something had shifted in James. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them with a warm smile. "Today we'll get a clearer view of the baby," the doctor explained, adjusting the ultrasound equipment. He motioned for Harley to lie down as he applied the cold gel to her abdomen. As the transducer glided over her skin, Harley held her breath, the anxious anticipation building. James stood beside her, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the monitor. Then came the sound, the strong, steady rhythm of heartbeats. But not just one. "Well, here's the surprise we couldn't see last time," the doctor said, pointing to the screen. "You're expecting twins." Harley's eyes widened in shock. Twins? She had never considered the possibility. A wave of emotion washed over her, a mix of surprise, joy, and disbelief. Instinctively, she placed a hand on her belly, trying to process the overwhelming news. James, for his part, remained silent for a few moments. His usual serious expression softened, and for the first time, Harley saw something new in him, genuine awe. He leaned slightly forward, watching the screen intently. "Two?" he asked, almost as if needing confirmation. "Two," the doctor replied with a smile. "Both seem healthy and are growing well." The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of the heartbeats echoing in the room. Harley's heart swelled with a connection to the two lives inside her. Despite her attempts to remain emotionally distant, she couldn't help but feel deeply tied to them. James, standing beside her, seemed equally moved. He didn't speak, but his eyes told a story words couldn't express. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable, touched by the reality of becoming a father to not just one, but two. The ride back to the mansion was different. The silence wasn't cold or distant as it usually was, but heavy with meaning. Harley was the first to break it. "You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised," she said, trying to ease the tension. James sighed, his gaze fixed on the road. "I'm not, but this," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is different." Harley glanced at him, intrigued. James rarely showed emotions, but now he seemed lost in thought. "Is it scary?" she asked quietly. He turned slightly to look at her. "No, it's impressive," he replied. "Knowing that in a few months, two completely new beings will be here, depending on me." Harley felt a pang in her chest. She knew she would eventually have to let go of the babies, but hearing him speak about them with such care made her realize just how deeply connected she already was to them. "They also depend on me, at least for now," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. James nodded. "I know. And that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Harley. Not just physically, but in every way. That's important to me." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Harley didn't feel completely alone in this journey. He was looking out for her in his own way. That night, Harley sat on the terrace, gazing at the horizon, when James appeared again. There was something different about him, a hesitation she wasn't used to seeing. "I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today," he began, sitting down beside her. "Two babies. Two futures." Harley turned to him, surprised by his openness. "It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?" she asked. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights. "It's more than that," he said, his voice quieter. "This is the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't plan who these two will become. I can't control who they'll grow into." Harley felt a chill hearing those words. It was rare for James to admit something was beyond his control. She realized then, like her, he was changing, even if reluctantly. "Sometimes that can be a good thing," she said thoughtfully. "Not knowing what's next can bring things you never imagined." James looked at her as if he was truly considering her words for the first time. It seemed like, in that moment, he was starting to accept that not everything in life could be planned. In the days that followed, the news of the twins brought a subtle shift in the mansion. Daniel began making adjustments to the nursery that had been prepared for one baby, now adapting it for two. Harley watched the changes with mixed feelings. She knew the agreement required her to eventually give up the babies, but deep down, she realized it would be far harder than she had ever imagined. As the preparations continued, both Harley and James began to feel the weight of their agreement more keenly. The contract that had once seemed so simple was now becoming more complicated. The twins, still unborn, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had anticipated. One afternoon, after a medical appointment, James surprised her by insisting on escorting her to the car. Normally, Daniel or another staff member would do this, but James was there, holding the car door open for her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes sincere. Harley nodded, taken aback by the gesture. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." On the drive back to the mansion, their usual silence was broken when James spoke again. "Is there anything you need? Anything that might make you more comfortable?" Harley glanced at him, trying to read his expression. It didn't feel like a superficial concern. There was something more genuine about it. "No, I'm fine," she replied, but she couldn't help but wonder what had brought on this change in him. Harley wasn't sure how to interpret the shift in James. She wasn't sure if it was genuine concern or just a fleeting moment of kindness, but something had definitely changed. "Nothing to mind right now, but thank you for asking," she replied cautiously. James nodded, returning his focus to the road. But Leah sensed it. Something was subtly shifting in him. Despite her reservations, she couldn't deny that he seemed genuinely concerned about her. Back at the mansion, Harley noticed more signs of this change. One day, she found a set of new pillows and blankets in her room, accompanied by a simple note. "To help you rest better." It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning. Harley smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness. Later, as she sipped tea in the living room, James entered and quietly took a seat in the armchair across from her. He seemed more relaxed than usual, though his serious demeanor remained unchanged. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked bluntly. "Yes, I did." "It was thoughtful of you," Harley replied, studying him with curiosity. "Good. I want to make sure you're comfortable." "That's important to me," he said without looking away. Leah frowned slightly. As much as she appreciated the kindness, she couldn't help but feel the barrier of mistrust still there. "You're changing, James? Or at least it seems that way." "But I still don't know why," she said directly. He stared at her for a moment, as though deciding what to say. Finally he sighed. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm changing. But the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." The words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. It was rare to see James admit any vulnerability, but there he was, revealing a part of himself that had always seemed locked away. That night, Harley reflected on the conversation while gazing at the sky from the terrace. James wasn't what she had expected. He was still hard to figure out, but there was something undeniably human beneath that controlling exterior. She just didn't know if it was a good or bad thing. Meanwhile, James sat in his office, staring at the contract that defined his arrangement with Harley. For the first time, he felt the weight of it. When he'd started this agreement, he had a clear goal: to have an heir and move on with his life. But now, things weren't so simple. He was beginning to care, and that terrified him. The next morning, James joined Harley for breakfast, something he rarely did. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said directly. Harley looked up, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated before answering. "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people, and that's turned me into someone who maybe isn't easy to deal with." Harley stayed silent, letting him continue. "I've had experiences that taught me not to depend on anyone, to not let anyone get close enough to hurt me. But with you, with what we're building, I realize that maybe I'm wrong." Harley blinked in surprise at his honesty. It was rare to hear James talk about himself this way. "We all have our barriers, James," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we need to hide behind them forever." He nodded, seeming to consider her words. "Maybe you're right. But changing isn't easy for me." Harley gave a small smile. "No one said it would be." Later that day, James decided to join her for a walk in the garden. At first, they talked about trivial things, but soon the conversation returned to the babies. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, surprising her. "No, not yet. I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own," she replied. "I think it would be fair to do it together," he said. To Harley's amazement, she realized James was trying to be more open, more present. And while she was still cautious, she couldn't ignore that he was making an effort. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the warm colors of the sky. "I never imagined I'd be here, doing something like this," Harley said almost to herself. "Neither did I," James responded with a slight smile. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Harley looked at him, noticing that for the first time, James seemed to be letting his guard down. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a contract but the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, everything felt like it was moving forward as usual. Harley felt the weight of the pregnancy in every movement, but she was determined to keep up with her routine. James, as always, was buried in documents in his office. Their interactions, though still frequent, had become a kind of silent comfort for both. But that day, something was different. Just before lunch, Harley felt a sharp, sudden pain. It was unlike any discomfort she had felt before. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another typical pregnancy ache, but the intensity increased. Alarmed, she called Daniel, who immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. "James needs to know about this," Daniel said, helping Harley to sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Harley nodded, trying to control her breathing as another wave of pain hit. Daniel went to get James, who appeared in the room within minutes. His usually impassive face showed something rare, genuine concern. "Harley, what's happening?" he asked, quickly approaching. "I think it's happening," she gasped. "The babies are coming." For a moment, James seemed frozen, but he quickly regained control. He grabbed the phone, ordering the driver to get the car ready and instructing Daniel to gather everything they would need for the hospital. "We're going now," he said, his voice firm but tinged with a sense of urgency Harley had never heard before. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions: fear, excitement, and the overwhelming realization that everything had changed. Harley focused on managing the pain, each wave of discomfort sending sharp reminders of the life-changing moment ahead. James sat beside her, his hand firmly holding hers. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the weight of what was happening. His grip was automatic, but there was an unspoken depth to it. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady yet laced with an undertone of anxiety. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Harley didn't respond, but something in his words provided a strange calm amidst the pain. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Thanks to James's meticulous planning, a medical team was already on standby. Without delay, Harley was taken to the delivery room, and James refused to leave her side despite the staff's attempts to have him wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, his hand still in hers. "I'm not going anywhere." Hours passed, each moment stretched with intensity, and James witnessed a strength in Harley he hadn't expected. With each contraction she remained determined, her focus unwavering. Finally, the first cry echoed through the room, a sound both small and powerful, reverberating with emotion. "A boy!" the doctor announced, smiling as the baby was carefully placed on a table nearby. James couldn't tear his eyes away. His heart raced, his mind still trying to process the reality of it all. Before he could fully absorb the moment, another cry filled the room. "A girl," the doctor said softly. "A daughter." Harley, exhausted but filled with a soft glow, looked at the twins being gently cleaned and wrapped in blankets. She longed to hold them, but she knew the moment was fleeting. James stood frozen for a few seconds, watching the doctor work. Then, as if something inside him had finally broken, he moved closer to Harley, took her hand, and said, "You were incredible." "Thank you." Silent tears streamed down Harley's face. She couldn't tell if they were from joy, relief, or the heartbreak of knowing she would have to part with them soon. Soon, the babies were handed to her. She held them carefully, their small, fragile bodies filling her with overwhelming love. She studied them, tiny fingers, closed eyes, their soft breaths. It was an intense love that swelled within her, and she knew she would carry a part of them with her forever, no matter what came next. James stood by her side, silent but visibly moved. When he finally held the boy in his arms, his usual hardened expression softened in a way Harley had never seen before. He seemed to connect with something far beyond the idea of an heir. It was life in its purest form, a bond he'd never allowed himself to feel before. When he held the girl, James closed his eyes, as if imprinting the moment into his memory. When he opened them, he looked at Harley and spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "They're perfect," he said, and Harley saw something in his eyes that took her by surprise, genuine gratitude. She nodded, still holding the boy. Tears fell freely now, but she didn't care. That night, as Harley rested in her room, James stayed by the baby's side in the hospital observation area, watching them sleep. A flood of emotions overwhelmed him, emotions he didn't know how to control. For the first time, he realized that these children weren't just part of a plan, a legacy. They were his connection to something greater, something he had never allowed himself to feel before, true love. Daniel arrived, carrying coffee. She set it on a nearby table and gently asked, "Mr. Gale, is everything all right?" James looked at her, clearly struggling to find the right words. For the first time in a long while, he found himself speaking from a place of vulnerability. "I think it is," he said softly. "I think it really is." Daniel smiled before quietly leaving James alone with his thoughts and the twins. Meanwhile, Harley woke up in her room, feeling the heavy weight of loneliness. As much as she wanted to feel happy, the contract still loomed over her. The babies, the center of her existence now, wouldn't be hers for much longer. The time to leave was coming, and the thought of walking away from them broke her heart. She glanced at the babies' cribs, where they slept peacefully, and a wave of emotion rose within her. Tears threatened, but she forced them back. She didn't want her last moments to be marked by weakness. She had signed the contract, and now it was time to fulfill it, even though it felt impossible. Daniel knocked softly on the door and entered with a worried expression. "Is everything ready?" he asked quietly. Harley swallowed hard, pushing the emotions deep inside. "Yes, thank you for everything, Daniel." Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Gale." Harley forced a smile, her heart aching. "It's not about what I want. It's about what was agreed upon." Daniel didn't press further. He simply nodded and left, promising to let James know that Harley was ready to leave. When Harley came down the stairs with her suitcase in hand, she found James waiting for her in the foyer. He stood there as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. James stood by the front door, his gaze fixed on Harley. The man before her was a far cry from the cold, calculating figure she had first met. This James seemed vulnerable, as though something precious was slipping through his fingers. The silence stretched, heavy and unspoken, until Harley broke it. "Everything's ready." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to her, his eyes intense. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Harley swallowed, a lump in her throat. She held her ground, her resolve steady. "That was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on." James stood still for a moment, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out the contract. He held it loosely between his fingers, as if it were a trivial piece of paper. This contract, he paused, his voice firmer now. It should never have defined what's between us. Before Harley could respond, James tore the document into pieces, letting them fall to the floor. The sound of paper ripping echoed through the foyer, a declaration that filled the space between them. "I don't want you to go," he said, his voice rougher now. "I don't want this to end here." Harley froze, her eyes locked on the shredded pieces at her feet. Her heart raced, torn between the fear of change and the pull of something she couldn't ignore. "James, you can't just tear up a contract and expect everything to change. It's not that simple." James took another step toward her, his expression filled with emotion. "I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been simple for me. But these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit." His eyes locked with hers. "I need you, Harley. Not just because of the twins, but because you've brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing." Her heart ached with his words, but she resisted, shaking her head. "And how do I know this is real?" Her voice trembled. "How can I trust that you won't change your mind? That you won't pull away when things get tough?" James took a deep breath, his expression pained. "Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You showed me that I don't need to be afraid of connecting, of being human. Yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Tears welled up in Harley's eyes, but there was still a wall inside her she couldn't quite break through. "I fell in love with you, James," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again. I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same?" James stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. She could feel his breath on her skin, the intensity of his words. "Because you changed everything for me. And I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you, but I'm willing to try. Every day for the rest of my life, if you give me that chance." His words pierced through her defenses. She felt something inside her begin to give way. She knew there were risks, but for the first time, she considered that maybe it was worth facing them. "What if it doesn't work out?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. James took her hands in his gaze unwavering. "Then we'll try again. And again, if necessary. I won't give up on you." In that moment, the world seemed to stop. Harley felt her doubts begin to fade, replaced by something stronger, hope. She looked into James's eyes and saw a man who was truly willing to let go of his control, to be vulnerable with her. Slowly, she nodded, letting the tears fall freely. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." James exhaled a long breath, a mixture of relief and hope flooding him. He pulled her into a tight embrace, and for the first time, Harley felt like this was where she was meant to be. The next morning, James's mansion felt different. Harley woke to the soft sounds of the twins stirring in the nursery next door. There was a sense of peace in the air, something she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the weight of uncertainty. She had chosen to stay, and more importantly, James had chosen to open his heart to her. Together, they were building something new. She went to the nursery, finding the twins awake and cooing softly in their cribs. Harley leaned over, stroking their soft cheeks and whispering words of affection. She was lost in the moment when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw James standing in the doorway, watching her with a slight smile. His eyes, once cold and distant, were now softer, filled with something Harley could only describe as love. "Good morning," he said, stepping into the room. He walked over to the babies, gently picking up their son. "Good morning," Harley replied, watching him. James looked down at the baby boy in his arms, his eyes softening. "I don't think I ever imagined this moment would feel so natural," he said, almost to himself. Harley smiled, watching him grow into his role as a father. There was something profoundly fulfilling about seeing James so devoted to their children. In the weeks that followed, James, though inexperienced, made an effort to learn how to care for the babies. He changed diapers, helped with feedings, and made sure Harley never felt alone. It wasn't easy for him, but he was trying, trying in ways he'd never had to before. And that, in itself, was more than Harley could have hoped for. At first, James was a bit clumsy with the babies. He fumbled with bottles and even attempted to sing lullabies, though his gravelly voice wasn't exactly melodic. Still, for Harley, his dedication spoke volumes. It was clear he was changing for them, for the family they were becoming. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the twins peacefully sleeping in their cribs nearby, James turned to Harley. His expression was serious but calm. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What is it?" Harley asked, her curiosity piqued. James took a deep breath, then continued, "I want us to be a real family. Not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side, forever." Harley was quiet for a moment, taken aback by the intensity of his words. Their feelings for each other had certainly grown, but hearing him speak so openly about forever was something she hadn't anticipated. "James, this is a big step," she replied, her voice filled with uncertainty as she processed the moment. "Are you sure?" He reached for her hands, looking deeply into her eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said with unwavering certainty. "I know this won't be easy. I've made mistakes in the past, but I want to build something with you. Something that's not based on contracts or obligations, but on love." Harley felt the sincerity in his words, and tears welled up in her eyes. She nodded slowly, her heart full. "I want that too, James." A few weeks later, they had an intimate ceremony in the mansion's gardens with only a few close people in attendance, including Daniel and some of the staff who had become an important part of their journey. The day was perfect, sunlight filtering through the trees and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of flowers. Harley wore a simple yet elegant dress, while James looked sharp in a suit. The twins, dressed adorably, were in Daniel's arms, who couldn't hide the tears of joy as James and Harley exchanged their vows. They spoke from the heart. James promised to be the man Harley deserved, someone who would always stand by her side, no matter what. Harley, in turn, promised to trust him and help him become the best version of himself. At the end of the ceremony, as they stood embracing each other with the twins in their arms, Daniel remarked, "You make a beautiful family." And it was true. For the first time, James, Harley, and the babies were exactly where they were meant to be. After the ceremony, life continued with its usual challenges, but there were also moments of pure joy. James and Harley worked together to create a loving home for their twins, learning the ropes of parenthood with sleepless nights and endless demands, balanced by a growing sense of happiness. One night, as Harley was putting the babies to bed, James appeared at the bedroom door. Without a word, he walked over and wrapped her in a tight embrace. Harley rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, one that had become so familiar. "Thank you for not giving up on me," James whispered. "Thank you for showing me I could trust again," she replied softly. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, James and Harley were in the garden, watching the twins play on a soft mat in the grass. Their laughter filled the air, spreading an infectious joy. Harley turned to James, who was sitting beside her, a smile on his face. "Are you happy?" she asked, genuinely curious. James looked at her and then at the twins, before answering with a smile. "I never thought I could be this happy. You've given me more than I ever knew I needed. A family, a purpose, love." Harley smiled back, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even through challenges." "Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, the twins began babbling, their sounds mimicking Mama and Dada. Overwhelmed with emotion, James and Harley laughed and moved closer to their babies, wrapping them in all the love they had. It was a simple moment, unassuming yet powerful, showing that they had found something real. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was full of love, understanding, and hope. And that was all they needed to move forward together.